In a war that seemed to consume everything, time, innocence, and the land itself, one promise was carved into the soul of every soldier. It was a promise that defied the logic of the jungle, the chaos of the firefight, and the vast, indifferent ocean that separated a man from his home. It was the promise that you would not be left. Not ever. It was a sacred covenant, written in the unspoken glances between men huddled on a landing zone, a vow that your final journey would not be in mud and rain, but on a flight toward the sun. In the furnace of Vietnam, where the lines blurred between the living and the dead, this promise was the only compass point that held true. But a promise is only air until it is kept. It requires men. It requires machines. It requires a specific kind of courage. A courage not measured in enemies engaged, but in the quiet, solemn duty of retrieval. This is not the story of a battle won. It is the story of a faith upheld. This is the story of the helicopter pilots who flew into the silence after the battle, the men who navigated the Valley of Shadows to bring the dead back home. Their machine was the Huey, the UH-1 Iroquois. Its sound was the heartbeat of the war, a rhythmic thwop, thwop, thwop that announced either salvation or destruction. For the combat assault, it was a chariot of steel, bristling with M60s, its belly full of young men ready to meet the fire. For the dust-off pilots, it was an ambulance, a desperate race against the golden hour, a frantic plea for just one more minute. But there was a third kind of mission, one spoken of in hushed tones, one that flew when the guns had gone quiet and the dust-offs had taken the last of the wounded. These were the Graves registration missions, the GR birds. They were often stripped, carrying only the pilot, the crew chief, the gunner, and a cargo of empty olive-drab vinyl bags. The pilots who flew these missions were a different breed. They were not cowboys. They were ferrymen. They were tasked with the war's most profound, most emotionally shattering responsibility: to fly into the void, to find what was lost, and to begin the long journey home. The call would come after the smoke cleared. A unit, having paid the ultimate price to take a hill or hold a line, would be forced to pull back, leaving their fallen comrades on the field. The jungle, the heat, the enemy, they were all relentless. A body left to the elements was a victory for the chaos. And so, the call would go out. A set of coordinates, a grid square, a cold landing zone. Cold was the term, but it was rarely true. An LZ that had seen American casualties was often watched. The enemy knew the Americans would come back for their dead. They knew it was a core principle, a vulnerability they could exploit. To fly a GR mission was to fly into a potential ambush, to risk the living for the Sakef, the dead. It was an act that baffled enemy commanders, this American obsession with retrieval. But to the men flying, it was the only thing that made sense. If you were there, you'd never forget that sound. The sound of a lone Huey coming back, not for the fight, but for the fallen. A typical crew was young. The pilot, a warrant officer, might be 21 years old. His calloused hands on the cyclic stick had the touch of a surgeon. He had to land this several-ton machine with impossible delicacy, often on terrain that was not a clearing, but a crater, a patch of blasted earth between shattered trees. His crew chief and door gunner, perhaps even younger, were not just technicians and protectors. On these missions, they were acolytes. They were the ones who would step out of the relative safety of the aircraft and into the profound, heavy silence of the battlefield. The air in the helicopter on the flight out was thick. No one spoke. The wind hammering through the open doors was the only sound, carrying the scent of jet fuel, wet canvas, and the metallic humidity of the highlands. The pilot's eyes were not on the ground, searching for movement. They were on his gauges, on the horizon, on the map coordinates that marked a place of terrible loss. Imagine the approach. The pilot feathers the collective, the Huey descending like a hawk. The landing zone is not a bustling base. It is a clearing, perhaps still smoking. The surviving members of the platoon might be there, huddled behind a meager perimeter, their eyes hollow. They have been waiting. They have been guarding their friends. The pilot sets the skids down so gently, it feels like an apology. The rotor wash flattens the tall elephant grass, revealing the terrible stillness of the scene. The crew chief and gunner unhook. They move with a practiced, solemn efficiency. There is no shouting. There is only the wind of the blades and the quick, respectful motions of their hands. They are retrieving not just a casualty. They are retrieving someone's brother, someone's son. They are handling the vessel that contained a life, a future, a world. The surviving soldiers watch, their faces a mixture of gratitude and profound, soul-deep exhaustion. They help. They carry their brother to the bird. It is the last favor they can do for him. This was the psychological crucible of the GR pilot. He was a witness to the war's final punctuation mark, day after day. While other pilots returned to base buzzing with adrenaline, recounting the hot extraction or the danger-close fire support, the GR pilot returned in silence. He flew the return trip with a cargo that did not speak, a cargo that weighed more than its physical pounds. It was the weight of memory, the weight of a life cut short. He flew over the same stunning emerald-green jungle that looked so beautiful from 500 feet, a landscape that hid so much pain. He was the shepherd of the lost, and the burden of that honor was immense. They developed a quiet fatalism, a dark gallows humor perhaps, but beneath it was a bedrock of respect. They knew, in a way no one else could, the true cost of every grid square, every operation, every political decision made 10,000 miles away. They were the ones who had to count the receipts. The technical skill required was extraordinary. These LZs were often on the side of a mountain, requiring a toe-in landing, where only the front of the skids touched the earth. The helicopter hovering, its rotor blades inches from trees, while the crew worked behind them. The pilot had to hold the machine perfectly still, his feet dancing on the anti-torque pedals, his hand on the collective making microscopic adjustments, fighting the wind, fighting the machine's own desire to drift. All the while, he scanned the tree line, his door gunner facing outward, finger on the trigger of the M60, praying the silence would hold. The enemy knew this ritual. A sniper's bullet, a single RPG, could turn this mission of mercy into a new tragedy, creating more fallen men who would, in turn, need their own retrieval. It was a terrifying, sacred gamble. But the machine itself, the Huey, was more than a truck. It was a symbol. Its design was utilitarian, but its role became spiritual. The thrum of its engine was a promise. For the wounded, it was the sound of hope. For the men guarding their fallen, it was the sound of closure. Comment, I remember the Huey, if that sound still lives in you. That simple single-engine turbine, that wide-open cabin, it was a vessel of compassion. The pilots trusted it, loved it, cursed it, but they knew it was the only thing that could do this job. It could land on a spot the size of a dinner table. It could take incredible punishment, and it could carry the weight of their duty. It was the bridge between the world of the living and the final, respectful journey home. The journey did not end when the Huey landed back at a major base like Da Nang or Tan Son Nhut. The pilot's job was done, but the promise was only halfway kept. The helicopter would land near a row of refrigerated Conex containers, the temporary home of the U.S. Army mortuary. Here, another team of unsung heroes took over, the mortuary affairs specialists. These men, often vilified in popular culture, were patriots of the highest order. They worked in cold, sterile silence, under fluorescent lights, with a singular mission: to restore identity and dignity to the fallen. They were detectives and artists, working tirelessly to ensure that the man who returned to his family was the man they knew. They inventoried personal effects: a letter from a girlfriend, a Zippo lighter, a worn photograph. These items were sacred relics. the last tangible pieces of a life. The GR pilot would shut down his turbine. The sudden silence was always the loudest sound of the day. He would unstrap, light a cigarette, his hands perhaps shaking, not from fear, but from the release of tension. He would watch the transfer cases, draped in the American flag, being loaded onto the massive C-141 Starlifter for the long flight across the Pacific. He had done his part. He had flown into the heart of sorrow and brought his brothers out. He had held the line between memory and oblivion. He would go to the operations shack, file his report, and try to wash the smell of the mission from his skin. He would try to sleep, and he would get up and do it again tomorrow. This was the nature of their courage. It was not the explosive courage of the assault. It was the enduring courage of the witness. It was the courage to face the unfiltered consequence of war, to absorb that grief, and to fly anyway. They flew knowing their mission offered no glory, no headlines. Their reward was not a medal. It was the quiet knowledge that they had honored the pact. They were the guardians of the promise. In a war defined by moral ambiguity, the mission of Graves registration was a point of absolute moral clarity. It was right. It was just. It was necessary. Years later, when the war was a distant, echoing memory, these pilots would not speak of the firefights. They would speak of the silence. They would speak of the faces of the men on the ground, the gratitude in their eyes. They would speak of the weight of the flight home. They were changed, transformed by this solemn task. They had been young men, boys really, who were forced to become philosophers at 2,000 feet, contemplating mortality, duty, and the fragile thread that separates here from gone. They bore a burden that few could understand, but they bore it with a grace that was almost holy. The legacy of these pilots is not written in history books about great battles. It is written on the headstones in Arlington and in the quiet, tree-lined cemeteries of small-town America. Their legacy is the closure they provided to thousands of families, the knowledge that their son, their husband, their father, was not abandoned in a foreign land. The helicopter pilots who brought the dead back home were the keepers of the nation's soul. They flew their metal birds through the gates of hell to ensure that every man had a final homecoming. They reminded us that even in the midst of the most brutal conflict, humanity is measured not by how we fight, but by how we care for those who have fallen. Theirs was the last, most important flight. The sound of the Huey has faded from the skies of Vietnam. The jungle has reclaimed the landing zones, but the promise remains. The promise that we leave no one behind. It is a promise kept by the courage of those few who flew into the darkness to retrieve the light. If this story moved you, write below. We never forget.